My name is Russell Brewer. I'm an associate professor at in criminology at the University of Adelaide, and this is
Bulmer. I work at the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, which is a non-for-profit charity here in Australia.
Groovy. And today we're going to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing around developing a systematic approach for identifying leads in CSAM investigations using automated biometric technologies. So, like Rutger yesterday, I don't like being chained to a lectern. So I got organized at the beginning of the session and managed to get myself a little roving mic so I could walk around. So yeah, let's get this party started. So before we begin and start talking about the actual project that I'm going to introduce to you today, I just wanted to tell you a bit about some of the work that we're doing in Adelaide at our Adelaide Cybercrime Laboratory. So the Adelaide Cybercrime Lab is an interdisciplinary hub of researchers working on a myriad of different projects, broadly categorized into two different streams. First, we have a series of projects that are interested, like Rutger, on identifying the factors, the forces that drive pathways into and out of various forms of cybercrime and cyber deviance. In addition to that, we actually work with law enforcement partners and industry partners to develop digital forensic tools to detect and combat various forms of cybercrime as well. And in particular today, we're going to be talking about one particular capability that we developed with police here in Australia to detect and investigate, make it easier to investigate child sexual abuse. I would be absolutely remiss at an AIC conference not to acknowledge the tremendous funding supplied by the AIC to develop this capability. We would not have been able to progress this work this far had it not been for those incredibly generous contributions. So we thank the AIC for that. And I also want to acknowledge my tremendous and interdisciplinary team, including Warren, also colleagues in the digital forensics, colleagues in the United States, biometrics experts at various universities, psychologists, legal scholars, defense scientists, industry stakeholders, contributions from Oracle Corporation, and supplying some of the tech that underpins the capabilities that we've developed today. So, with all that intro at hand, let's talk about the problem that we've set out to address. When you're dealing with cybercrime, and when you're dealing with cybercrime data, you're dealing with a unique problem in that, or a big data problem. With the proliferation of digital devices, networked technologies like the internet have resulted in a trove of data that's been generated related to each and every case. There's just too much data for investigators to reasonably be able to address, reasonably be able to handle. The availability of digital intelligence information outpaces the resources that law enforcement realistically have to manage various crime problems. We've heard from various speakers over the course of the day and yesterday about the tremendous amount of information available on the dark web relating to child sexual abuse. We know that even seizures, once an individual has been located, a door is being kicked in, they've been arrested, their devices seized, that the amount of data contained on those devices is astronomical, right? And police, law enforcement, investigators, analysts just don't have the resources to keep up. A lot of this work, when you do identify a suspect, when you do kick in the door and seize those devices, going through those devices is often very manual, very laborious, requires humans to actually sift through different types of data using a suite of different tools to extract different types of information from different types of files. This work, of course, when we're dealing with child sexual abuse material, has the potential to have significant mental health implications for those investigations. On top of all this, we know from the policing literature more broadly that intelligence operations also tend to focus, of course, on a particular person of interest, right? And this makes sense. Like, we've kicked in a door, we've seized somebody's phones, tablets, laptops, hard drives, USB drives, etc. We're looking for files that contain that particular person. And that introduces a lot of bias in an investigation, right? Because we know that specific persons of interest are actually often identified through really fragmented, sometimes spotty intelligence, right? From wiretaps, from interviews with suspects or co-offenders who lie, right? So the information that we have going into an investigation isn't always necessarily going to be complete. So when it comes to dealing with this intelligence problem, this big data problem in the child sexual abuse space, investigators, and we've talked about it across various sessions across the day, have adopted, a suite of digital forensics tools to start to address this problem, but also have started to generate databases of known CSAM that new files can be compared against. So I'm just going to turn it over to Warren, and he's going to just talk through some of the solutions that are currently in this space.
You're going to trip on something at some point.
Definitely.
I noticed that this conference, they don't provide translators for Canadian transplants with 2 Canadians speaking in Australia. It's pretty common. You're just going to have to work through if you're struggling understanding me. So one of the things that I would stress about, when you hear conferences like this and you hear other speakers, you may be hearing something for the very first time, but the child exploitation phenomenon has been going on for decades. I started in this crime type in 2003. Some of you were in high school or less than that when I started investigating child abuse cases on the internet. So the reality is that there are a lot of solutions that have been tried. Some stayed, some went away. But there is a global recognized system of child exploitation databases. Dr. Salter referred to one yesterday, Dr. Quayle again this morning. There are these databases, whether it be NCMEC or whether it be Interpol. These are databases where child exploitation material, sexual abuse material is stored by various agencies, by various different reasons. Some of it is their legal framework. It is where they categorize material based on the in-country legal regime. They then produce reports out of that, and they then go to court and prosecute the offender because he had 232 images of category 1. And he's convicted of possession of child abuse material based on that criteria. Others are strictly victim identification databases, have nothing to do with legal categorization. They are places where cases are stored, where victims have been identified, or victims are being stored there in order to law enforcement to find. So there are unsolved cases for databases, there are solved cases databases. There is a globally recognized one. You've heard the name maybe from yesterday if you remember Michael's presentation. It's called ICSA. Before ICSA it was called ICAID. I've contributed hundreds of images of ICAID before it became ICSA when I was doing the victim identification work from 2003 to 2009. And so these databases, they move forward, they evolve, the technology improves, more people get access to them. The one downside about all of them is they're not connected to one another. They're separate. They're separate for political reasons, they're separate for legal reasons, they're separate for a number of reasons that many of you or academics would just find mind-boggling, the reason why they're not shared. And so a law enforcement individual sitting and looking at a child abuse image on their screen has to search 7 or 8 or 10 different databases worldwide in order to find out an answer about whether that case is solved, unsolved, where it's solved, who's the case officer, what do I need to do about this image, what do I need to know about it? And that's just not acceptable by today's standards. Technology facilitates the ability for all of those things to be connected in some way or another. Now, the methodology that they're connected, those are things that can be explored in other solutions, whether you utilize technology to do visual matching of images, just like you would do on Google, upload an image, search it, and see if the same image exists, or if we use computer science in network science to say, here's some values, some numbers, some representations of images without having to see the image itself. We call those hashes. Hashes or fingerprints of files can be shared. Those databases all have hashes in them, and the hashes can be distributed. And to this today, they kind of are in some certain ways. Here in Australia, we have a national database. It was something that when I worked at the AFP for 3 years, that was my primary job, was to create, deploy, and lead the team that ordered to build that national database that's now rolled out across the country. And we use the AVID database here in Australia by law enforcement. They use it for both purposes. They use it for victim identification efforts. They also use it for categorization of images for court. In there is intelligence, and the same goes for the NCMEC database in the US. There's intelligence. Even though it's US-centric, there's still intelligence or value that we could utilize in Australia, and vice versa. Our system has intelligence that the Americans could benefit from just because of how we all view our images, how we tag them, how we organize them, how we categorize them. So if we talk about solutions, and you want to centralize solutions, you want to take the best bits of all of those databases and combine them together and give law enforcement the maximum efficiency. And then when they look at an image on the screen, they have one place to look, or one place that automatically feeds them information, and they can make a decision about moving that file into the solved box and move on to the next one. Or they have an ability to give information to the prosecutor about a case, because all of that is fed to them from all of those different databases in one solution.
Right.
Fair?
So, with that context, then let's move along to talk about the solution. Come on. There we go. The capability that we have developed. So our team has put together a software platform that seeks to streamline the intelligence gathering and analytical process. This is done through the automated extraction of various forms of intelligence about all persons contained across various different types of files. What we do is we extract this information, these various intelligence signals. We draw information together about each person from myriad sources, from the files, from information contained within the files themselves, but also data contained within pre-existing databases of known CSAM, to be able to start to map the connections between the various people that are identified within, in this case, what we'll talk about today is within a seizure, in a particular seizure, and then plot those connections using network science and actually start to do some really cool modeling around the underlying structures that underpin these networks. It is worth noting that the tech that we've developed it for use in child sexual abuse cases, but it also has applications in other crime, counterterrorism or organized crime or defense contexts as well. So what our tool does in a child exploitation environment is we focus on the use of digital media files. All right, so we identify, extract, and then match information contained within these media files or about these media files. So we use extract biometric information, facial recognition, but also voice recognition from the persons contained within those files. We make assessments of other personal information about those individuals, how old they are, what their gender is likely to be. And then we also utilize file metadata that we also extract. We talked about hash values, but there's actually a lot of other potential metadata that can be available in an investigation. Geolocation data, camera sensor information, file creation dates. The list goes on and on and on. Notably as well, the capability that we've developed has been built with extensibility in mind, right? So we've designed it to be able to integrate other identifiable information from files using stuff like object recognition, language detection, additional biometrics like vascular patterns, tattoos, nail bed and knuckle forensics. The list is honestly endless. And also in the future moving towards other data types, which I'll talk to at the end of the presentation in more detail. So let's talk about the study that we've actually undertaken using this tech. The aim of this particular study is to systematically consolidate a range of different intelligence data from files within the files, but also these extant databases at scale so that we can start to generate investigative leads and examine the relationships between every person that appears within every media file extracted from all devices that were seized in a particular seizure. And we're interested in asking two key research questions in this study. First, which individuals, so in this context, we have the victim or victims, as you'll see, the offenders, but also other people that feature in this seizure, but also which files feature the most prominently across the whole seizure. So which are the individuals, which are the files that we should be caring the most about? Second, how can we use these file attributes, where these files are come from, their metadata, etc. How can we use those to identify where this offending is most likely to be occurring? So, how do we do this? Let's talk about the method. So, the data that I'm going to talk through today originates or is derived from one large Australian seizure of 519,727 media files. So obviously the seizure contained many millions upon millions on millions of files. From that seizure, from those images of multiple devices, we were able to extract more than 500,000 media files for this analysis. These contained, now obviously, many of us have iPhones and iPads and MacBooks, etc. A lot of these same files are actually synced from one device to the other, and this is a problem that law enforcement have to face when they're extracting and looking through all this data, that you've got duplicates of a lot of the same files. So we've actually gone through and removed these duplicates just so we know we're dealing with original data. So there's about 65,000 duplicate media files that were extracted or removed from this analysis, leaving us with 454,733 unique files comprising about 450,000 images and about 2,000 video and or audio files. So upon identifying all these unique files, media files, they are ingested into our tool, whereby we extract the file hash, which we save for later. We use those hashes actually to identify which files are duplicates or not. We then extract metadata from those files, and we run these files through a sexually explicit detector to identify which files are likely to contain or not contain sexually explicit information, as well as then use those hashes to compare against these other databases of known or unknown CSAM. Next, for each file, we determine whether or not it's a video file or an image file and is visual. We will then go through, if it's an image, you go through the image. If it's a video file, we'll go through frame by frame of every video and identify any face that is contained in any frame. We'll extract the features from those faces. We'll assess the quality of those faces. Quality is really important when it comes to facial recognition, because we know that if you have garbage coming in, you'll have garbage coming out. So we want to ensure, particularly when we're dealing with law enforcement data, that we have really high quality data ingested into the tool. So we'll assess that quality, and then what we'll do for each file is we will identify a reference face for each person that appears in each file. So the highest quality face, so if I am in a video and I appear in thousands of frames, we will identify which is the absolute best face of mine for matching purposes across the data set. And we'll do that for every single file. Likewise, we do something similar for files that contain audio information. So we'll actually we'll rip the audio track and feed it through what's called a voice activity detector, whereby we'll identify any segments of audio that contain a high quality voice, or what we call voiced audio. What we'll then do is feed that through a process, a really complex process of something called speaker diarization, whereby we will work out where I'm talking, where Warren's talking, and where we're talking over each other, and essentially identify which segments of voice belong to me, which belong to Warren, and get rid of those where we're talking over one another. We stitch those like for likes together to create, again, high quality segments of voice so that we can later use that for matching purposes. And then we'll go through that process of deduplication again. We don't need multiple segments of my voice per file. We only need a couple of really good ones. Then what we'll do, so as you could imagine, if you go through this for 454,000 files, this creates an astronomical amount of data that you still, like, we're talking billions of matches, matching one file, or each feature to the next, right? So we go through and undertake those billions of matches, and then what we do is we start to cluster this information together. So we identify all of the faces that belong to myself, belong to Warren, and we bring all of that information together in a simple to use interface that maps the connections between, we call this a two-mode network, a file, we call this a biometric cluster, so a cluster of all Russell's faces, all Russell's voices, and another file. So we can identify which individuals are contained within each and every file, and how are those individuals connected together across the whole seizure. Okay, so what does this actually look like? Whoa, okay. So there's a lot going on here. Let me explain. So this is what our two-mode network looks like, all right? We've got these black nodes. They represent a person. And in fact, the size of that node represents how many files that individual is contained within. The bigger the node, the more prominent they are in that seizure insofar as they appear across lots of different files. The green, as you've probably gathered, are the number of files that, well, they're just the files. And then there are so many connections that you actually can't see many of the ties that exist between them. So the structure of this network's actually really interesting and quite intuitive. Like, this is what you would actually expect when it comes to a seizure of one's devices, right? You're going to get this large hub of individuals, right? An individual that is contained, or several individuals that are contained in lots and lots and lots of files that are connected to quite a few different people in a lot of kind of weird ways, right? And this makes sense. Like, if you seized my phone and my laptop and my iPad, I would feature at the center of my network, right? Myself, my wife, my kid would feature in that network. Maybe my kid's friends over here, people appearing in the background at a photograph in a restaurant, or on sport, my ice hockey team, classic Canadian. So you're gonna have a lot of people that are directly or indirectly connected to me. Likewise, in this network, we actually have a lot of smaller clusters, okay? We have a lot of clusters where we have one individual appearing in lots and lots and lots of files, or we've got pockets of 2 or 3 individuals coming together across lots and lots and lots of files, right? Again, when we think about this in a child sexual abuse context, this makes a lot of sense. This is what collections of individual victims are going to look like, right? As pockets across the network. And then what we actually see is there are a lot of individuals that just appear in 1 or 2 files. Now, the reason for this is because we've actually developed this tool for deployment by law enforcement. So we've actually been really, really strict with respect to the match thresholds that we've selected so as to not introduce false positives into this network. We don't want to be starting to draw faces and voices together where there is a chance that there might be a false positive there. So we've actually erred on making sure the genuine matches are coming through while those false positives are falling away. So as a consequence, we would, if we were to lower those match thresholds and permit a little more error to come in, we would see some of these clusters, not all of them, but some would get slightly larger. So let's layer on some more information. This is my kaleidoscope of color. This is the exact same graph, but what we've done here is we've layered the source of where those files are coming from. So anything in or yellowish has been extracted from the telephone. The tablet is in green, cloud storage in red, USB and SD cards in blue, portable hard drives, the laptop drive in purple, and again, those black nodes, they're the files, right? So what we can see is that perhaps unsurprisingly, it's really important to draw together information from a multitude of different sources when it comes to investigating a CSAM case, right? Some clusters contain files that are exclusively from one source, whereas others compile files from a series of different sources, right? And this, again, knowing what we know about child sexual abuse offenders, this individual was pretty fastidious in terms of keeping some of his devices dedicated to certain purposes versus others, right? Maybe not putting certain types of files on work devices or making sure particular things are stored on USB sticks or a laptop hard drive or something like that, right? So that those variety of sources are really important in this context. So now we know something about the data itself, where it comes from, the structure of that data and the structure of the network. We can start to direct our efforts at identifying sexually explicit material. Now let's start with what we know, right? Linking in now to those known CSAM databases. Okay. So what we've done here is we've identified all files that have been previously identified as known CSAM. And what we've done is we've hoovered them up into the middle of this network here. Right? And what we can see is there's a small pocket of files that are previously known to law enforcement, have been discovered and cataloged previously.
From a single database.
From just one of the many databases that Warren was talking about. All right? Now these represent less than 0.5% of all of the files that have been analyzed by the tool. And in fact, what we can see is they all have been extracted from either USB sticks or the laptop hard drive that was seized. What we could see as well, interestingly, what I made sure to do was to keep those ties in here so you could see exactly how these files cut across the entire seizure. They weren't linked to a particular cluster, but rather a series of different clusters across the whole network. And interestingly, and what I really want to point out, is that many of these files actually, many of these files are actually linking to other persons that haven't been to other persons and other files that haven't been previously cataloged, right? So we've got a cluster up here of about 15 different files, multiple different people, only one file of those 15 have been previously cataloged, right? And without cataloging that information, as we move on from that case, this information becomes lost. But there's even more that we can automatically start to glean from this data, moving beyond what we know to start thinking about what we don't know. So what we've done in the next slide, this is starting to get a little bit crazy, but we've now identified, layered on top of this, any file that contains sexually explicit content. And again, we've hoovered that to the middle of the network. And we can see that there is a lot more going on, a little more diversity in terms of the sources of those files, although frankly not that much diversity. Again, they're still appearing on those SD cards, those USB sticks, and that laptop hard drive. But what this is showing us is that there's way more happening in this network than those known hash values are going to suggest, right? And we can see, interestingly, that there are a lot of different connections between not only explicit files that we're interested in as investigators, but also other non-explicit files that might be of investigative interest, that might include critical clues that could crack a case wide open. But if we're just looking for CSAM, there's a potential that we can miss that. Now, what this is showing us is that there are potentially a heap of different files that are of investigative interest here, connected to a ton of different people across the network. So in a way, to be fair, we've gone from 450,000 files down to what amounts to several hundred at the middle of this graph. But that's still a lot to go through. And we can actually start to reorganize this information to make a little bit better sense of this. So what I've done in the last graph I'm going to show you is I've actually converted this data from a two-mode network, from files and people, to just a one-mode network. Connections between one person and the next. What this network is showing us is those nodes that are depicted as red. That means that that person, these nodes are all people now, that person is contained in at least one sexually explicit file. Just one. They might appear in 1,000 different files, but they're red if they appear in only one. Green is clean. Okay? So again, we see a similar network structure. We've got that is consistent with what we would intuitively think a seizure would look like, of all of a single person's devices. We've got this primary network at the center. We've got our offender right at the middle, and we have the victim, one victim. We also have a series of other offenders and victims associated with this, obviously numerous other collections across the seizure. What's interesting when you look at this is that it actually reveals quite a lot at a glance. Like, we haven't even looked at a single file yet, right? And we can actually understand a lot about what is going on here, right? We can see, for example, that we have some contact offending likely happening between the offender and that person's child. We see that that person has amassed a robust collection of child sexual abuse material that contain one or two people. And then we can also see other pockets of offending where we have lots of offenders and victims coming together. And we can derive this all by just looking at the structure of the network. And this can help, thinking about this structure can really help us in terms of starting to target where we're going to start, where are we going to start to put our resources in this investigation before we even look at anything. Because this has been all organized by a software program. So, what are the implications of all of this? These data-driven approaches have the potential to overcome that bias I spoke about on the first slide that might influence workflows and how law enforcement go about prioritizing resources, right? If we go back to that other slide, this is what we were interested in the first place, right? It was these activities that spurred this seizure. But there was actually a lot going on around this seizure that the investigators weren't aware were happening at first blush, without extensive manual review of all of these files. What we found in this seizure was there were tens of thousands unique individuals that were identified across hundreds of thousands of files. Most of these individuals actually only appeared in a single file. Doing this analysis also helped us to identify priority files, right? They were typically stored on select devices, usually portable devices, in this case these USB sticks and that laptop hard drive. And we were able to use information from these other devices that did not contain CSAM to actually elucidate the network structure beyond just CSAM to CSAM, but including other files that might be of interest. We identified numerous key persons of interest in this network, particularly through their direct links to one another across these different clusters. So all of this has a potential to actually help us address this big data problem, to identify priority files, priority subjects at the outset of an investigation can help point investigators to the files that might be of interest and warrant further examination. This has the potential to reduce the total number of files that investigators have to manually view and catalog, the amount of time they spend looking at them, and also the likelihood of inadvertently missing crucial intelligence within a seizure because you're not looking for it. So this helps us get a better understanding of what we don't know. Do you want to say something else about databases as well?
Can you just go back one slide?
Yeah.
So look, given the time that we had, we could have had 50 more of these diagrams with different filters on and off and with new data added. But just hypothetically follow along here. If we take just this one here and change from a standard marketplace nudity detector that many use and change it to a CSAM specific only classifier, then the red's going to become less because some of them are not actually going to be CSAM. They're going to be borderline, age difficult, probably adult, some of them, because it's detecting nudity, not child nudity, right? So the second level to that is now think about those databases. In those red files, there's going to be identified cases already. Those CSAM files, that child has been rescued years ago. Now we're going to turn that filter on, adding those databases because we brought that in when we processed, and the red files become less again. And so do the green files, because some of the green files, although they're not child abuse by definition, they're innocuous or non-pertinent pictures of children that were taken on a swing in a park or walking a dog on the street, because child sex offenders don't just collect only CSAM. They collect all pictures of children. So that's why you'll have the greens, even though they're not illegal and they're red, they're still pictures of children and may be of investigative interest. Absolutely. And then the final thing I would say is, if you think about adding other things in here, other databases. You eventually will have the ability, for example, you heard yesterday from Kel, there's no reason why we couldn't have another layer, a national layer that looks like this, where you take all of the Australian children that have been already identified in child abuse material, and you turn that on. And then for every seizure, you'll be able to print out a report and go to court and say, this offender had this many images of Australian children that are already identified and rescued. There's your victim impact statement written out for you from a graph. So there's all kinds of things that can be done. It's the only limitation is access to those existing sources that have been around for a long time, getting the permissions and everything, the legal requirements in order to use those. Once that's the hard part. The tech part's not the hard part. The hard part's the politics, getting access to the data.
We'll get there.
Yeah. So I think we have time for questions. Or?
Yeah. Oh, no, we're not done yet.
Oh, sorry.
Hold on.
Sorry, mate.
Hold on. So,
Give it to him.
2 minutes. Easy. So where to next? So this project has been ongoing for several years, and we hope that it will continue for the next several years. And we've got quite a few new, really interesting things in the pipeline. With all of this network data, you can actually start to do some really interesting modeling. When you start to consolidate all of this information from all of these different sources, you can start to leverage that information that might be in common. For example, we might have this individual may have wiped the metadata from all files that contain anything even remotely close to child sexual abuse material, but perhaps there's one file in there that links to that individual, that has a geolocation data, that has a file creation date, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can bring all of that information together, and we can start to model this information and get a better understanding of how the network has evolved over time, to start to work out which victims are likely currently being victimized against victims that may have been victimized 20 years ago and have likely aged out. You can also start to unpack and model where new connections are likely to form in the future based on all of the other individuals that someone has within their orbit, right? Is this person a school teacher that has access to a myriad of different kids from different contexts? A netball coach, an ice hockey coach, that goes on and on and on. We talked about moving forward with bringing together myriad other sources to link information contained within and about files to what we already know about what is known, or those known hash value database, and also augmenting, I mentioned this earlier, augmenting with other new algorithms, biometrics, age detect, there's really robust age detectors out there, CSAM classifiers, etc., object detection, to extract even more pertinent information from within files and tell a story about all of that information brought together. And then also moving beyond just digital media files to start thinking about other data types, texts, who is calling who is texting who, and in what contexts, right? Algorithms already exist that are able to match the syntax and prose of individuals to identify whether or not the author of this corpus of text is in fact the same as the author of this corpus of text without having to link usernames or anything like that, right? Those capabilities exist. It's just a matter of bringing it all together under one roof and starting to generate what we call multi-level networks. We have the biometric connections, but then they are, of course, linked into other sorts of data and networks that connect individuals together. So bringing all that information together has tremendous potential. That's enough from me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask or send me an email and find out more on our website. Thank you.